All right. Hello, folks. Welcome. I say we'll give it another minute or so to let people as they start joining. But we're very excited to have everyone joining us today. We'll give it another minute or so and then we'll get started. As I do want to remind if folks could have themselves on mute as they join, that way we just don't get any audio feedback from you. We would really appreciate that. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started with our introduction. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen for a moment. But my name is Ray Slowick. I'm the museum educator for the Lombard Historical Society, and we're so excited that all of you guys have joined us for the first of our Taste of History series. We're really excited to be partnering with museums across the United States and across the world to, bring us a bit of that kind of road trip feel without even ever having to leave our home. So we're really excited to be kicking tonight off with the Sheldon Peck Homestead located in Lombard, Illinois. I'm joined by Allison Costanza, who is the executive director of the Lombard Historical Society. So we are going to show you a tour of our site. That is a video that will play. And then we will end with some question and answer. You're more than welcome when we get to that point to either unmute or just drop your questions in the chat.
We decided to pre-record tonight's tour because the Peck does look better in daylight, and to give everyone the opportunity to see the Peck during daylight hours. And we're really excited about this partnership, and the listing of all of the museums in participating in a Taste of History are listed on our website. And we will be posting every week the next museum leading up to the Taste of History event. And so just if you haven't already, register for the different museums. The next one's the Rosa Parks Museum. And we will be at the end of it posting information about donations. We are just doing this free, but donations are welcome. And all the proceeds benefit all the museums participating in this. So it's not just benefiting LHS, it's benefiting museums across the world, which it looks like we actually have one of our museums joining us tonight, which is really exciting. I believe, is this one of the Alaskan museums, I think, that's joining us tonight, maybe, possibly?
Yes, the Heritage Center.
Very exciting. So I highly encourage everyone to check out just the list of museums. And again, we're so excited about tonight's program and enjoying the Sheldon Peck Homestead. And Ray has been doing a great job of coordinating all this. She's our education coordinator. And so I'm so pleased that we've got such a great turnout for tonight. So enjoy, and we'll be monitoring the chat. And thanks, Ray. So let's kick things off.
Absolutely. I say, let me know if the sound is not playing, but let me know for whatever reason you are not um, able to hear.
Welcome to the Sheldon Peck Homestead, the oldest house in Lombard, Illinois. Lombard is about 20 miles west of Chicago, and this house is built by Sheldon and Harriet Peck, who arrived here in what was Babcock's Grove in 1837. Now, what you see here isn't your typical log cabin, which, you know, when you think of Illinois, you think of log cabins. This is actually a frame and post style home, which Sheldon would have known being from Vermont. Now, Sheldon and Harriet originally born in Vermont. Later they would go to New York and finally Chicago in the 1830s, where Sheldon was an itinerant painter. Now, in the 1830s, there was a bit of an economic downturn, and so the Pecks actually would come here to Babcock's Grove because they knew the Churchills. Now, what we see here today isn't how the Peck always looked. Frank Peck, Sheldon's youngest son, would take off the west portion of the home and raise the roof line to making it a half story larger than it is today. And they would keep the east side of the home. They kept the east side of the home. Now, in the 1990s, after 3 generations of Pecks had lived in the home, the Lombard Historical Society would take over the property and would restore it to its 1830s configuration. Now, in 2012, we were very fortunate to have applied to the National Park Service's Networks of Freedom and get the designation as a verified Underground Railroad site, which we'll learn more inside today.
So like many pioneer families, the Pecks had a lot of children and have a very large family tree. This was because you wanted a lot of hands to help work the farm. Now, you might think that Sheldon was the primary farmer in this family, but that is not the case. As he was going off painting and traveling for his work, he left the farm, which at its largest was about 180 acres, to his wife Harriet. Now, Harriet was known in the community as being someone who knew how to heal people, so if the doctor was too far away, she knew what herbs and natural plants could be used to make someone feel better, as well as she was known for her cheeses and pressing cider. So she really was the homemaker and really a central part in making this house feel like a home, and she truly loved what she did, which is really incredible. Now, we have some of the pieces from the Peck family on display today. We're really lucky to have one of the pieces from New York. As you can imagine, putting everything into a covered wagon, bringing your life across the country, you really have to pick and choose which pieces you want. And the gold and blue luster creamer is one of the pieces that survived the trip out for New York, and we're really fortunate that it survived to this day, and that's one of the things we really like to highlight. Yes. One of the other family pieces we have is the coverlet, which is behind the family tree. Now, we don't know if this coverlet was ever here in the home. However, it was donated by one of the Peck family members and would be very typical of what was seen during that time period. One of the challenges of this house being, a foot and post style house versus a log house is the walls are very thin. And we see this even today with our modern heating. And so you probably would have had quilts and coverlets like this covering the walls to provide that extra insulation, as well as provide heat on the beds. Harriet, like many of the women in her family, would have been very accomplished at needlepoint, and we're very fortunate that we actually have the last piece she worked on. It is incomplete and has the needles still in it, waiting for her to pick it back up. And we're very fortunate that the family has trusted us with this piece, so we can really show the human side of this family. They show the human side of this family. They played a very important role in our history, being the earliest settlers, and it's important to remember that they were a family who lived here and just like everyone else. The pieces in this china hutch are typical of what would have been seen as the family established themselves. As we mentioned, there were 3 generations of Peck members living in this home, and at the largest, they probably had at least 10 people sleeping in here. And there was only one real sleeping room up these ladder stairs, which you needed your hands and feet to crawl up. Imagine doing that in a dress. Now, what's really interesting about these posts is these are the original posts for this home that were created by Sheldon and his family, and so it's really cool that we're able to see the bones of the home. So, as we mentioned, Sheldon Peck was an itinerant folk artist, and folk art is artists who teach themselves, and so they don't necessarily get formal training, but they still create amazing works of art. It can range from things that you have in your home to portraits like Sheldon Peck did. So we know Sheldon Peck had 3 different art phases that we talk about. The first being his Vermont period, which is the earliest. He started painting in the 1820s, and this is where we get some of the kind of iconic style that is known as Sheldon Peck. One of the more frustrating things about Mr. Peck's art is that he didn't sign any of his works. So one of the ways that we're able to identify some of his paintings is through an iconic rabbit track motif, which is 3 stripes all close together. These can be found on detailings in clothes, sometimes in the borders of the portraits, but they don't appear in every Peck painting. So just because it's not there doesn't mean it isn't a Peck. It's also during the Vermont period that he paints 2 of the portraits that show what the people do in them. So they show a farmer and a rancher in here. We're very fortunate that we have a Sheldon Peck as part of our collection. This piece is Portrait of a Woman and is from his Vermont period. We believe it was painted in the mid-1820s. And you can see some of the fine detailing of the rabbit tracks that are on there. One of the other motifs from his work during this time is he would paint the figures on a dark background with dark clothes. So believe it or not, there are clothes on this woman in this painting. It's not just a floating head, but even up close, it's sometimes difficult to see the differentiation between the black of the background and the black of the clothes. But he didn't use that as an excuse. He still put in very fine detailing into the clothes of the people they were wearing. The next period we talk about is his New York period. So during this time, the Sheldon Pecks moved to Jordan, New York. And we start to see him refining more of his style. So you can see he has this very severe kind of 3/4 bust, looking at people. The eyes follow you. It's a little unnerving to walk around some of these portraits at night, I won't lie. And he starts to add details about what the people are doing. So for example, he painted his friend Deacon Churchill, and he's holding a book, which we know symbolizes that Mr. Churchill was a well-learned individual. Then in the 1830s is when he comes to Illinois. And so he makes a brief stop in Chicago, but as we said before, there was a little bit of an economic downturn, and people were no longer able to really afford the $50 or so that it would have cost to get a very nice portrait painted. And so he chose to come out here to what was Babcock's Grove and continue the rest of his Illinois period. This is when we see the biggest change in his style. He goes from painting these 3/4 bust portraits to starting to create multi-figure, full-length portraits. And the reason he does this is there is a new technology he is competing with, photography. And so he's really trying to make himself marketable to these families who are looking to preserve themselves for future generations. It's really here that we're able to identify him as a self-taught portrait, because you'll notice in this reproduction, the proportions of the feet are just a little off. So he really is able to capture the likeness of the people who are sitting for this portrait, but definitely I don't know anyone who has feet that are quite that thin. And Sheldon wasn't the only painter in his family. He actually ended up passing his artistic ability onto his children, both his son Charles Peck and his daughter Susan Peck. And we have a really cool painting that Susan did that we'll talk about as we learn more about the Underground Railroad.
As Ray mentioned, Susan Peck and Charles Peck, two of Sheldon's children, were also painters. And the biggest question we get here at the Sheldon Peck Homestead is, well, how do we know we're an actual Underground Railroad site? And that's a really good question. It takes a lot of documentation to verify that you're an Underground Railroad site. And when we talk about Underground Railroad history, we're talking about some really complicated things because it was illegal to help freedom seekers. So where are the records? How do you document something that was mostly undercover? We talk about the secret language of the Underground Railroad. Many people ask us about quilts, they ask us about conductors, hidey holes, and I'll get to that shortly and talk a little bit more in depth about that. But back to Susan. So we know what we know basically because of Sheldon Peck's children. Now this painting is by Susan Peck, and we call this painting Old Charlie. Now, how do we know it's Old Charlie? That's a really good question. Old Charlie is a lot of people. And in 2019, we actually got a grant from the National Park Service to investigate more about who Old Charlie was and where Old Charlie came from. And I highly encourage you to check our website because we have a lot of information about the different Old Charlies that we found in throughout the state of Illinois and even in Missouri. And we know a lot of this because of Frank Peck. Now, when Frank was in his 70s, he began to write journals and his remembrances. And he talks about Old Charlie and sitting on his knee and asking him why was he black and why was he white. And this is coming from a child, not really understanding, the difference about race. And for Frank, this was someone who was coming into their home and spending time in their home and teaching him his slave spirituals. And so we have documentation of this song that Old Charlie sang. And we know that slave spirituals were a mechanism for freedom seekers to be able to escape from freedom. Because most freedom seekers didn't know how to read and write. And so songs were really the mechanism that helped freedom seekers escape and gave them directions to come north. And we'll talk a little bit about conductors and the Underground Railroad here shortly. But what's great about this painting is that we see either Susan Peck or her sister singing with Old Charlie. Now, this would have been something that would have been hung in the house, which that was a big deal. Having a person who was white with a person of color featured in a painting during the 1840s was unheard of. And this is such a striking piece in terms of equality and talking about equality and really the fundamentals of the Peck family. And we know that the Peck children, they ranged in age. John was the oldest and Frank was the youngest. And there was almost a 20-year age gap between the youngest and oldest Peck child. And so we know what we know because of that time period between all the children. But again, Susan is an incredibly talented artist, as we can see here in the artwork. And it's because of this painting that we were, and Frank's writings, that we know what we know, and we've been able to dig deeper into those stories as late as last year, digging more and more as records become available, people donate things, and this is a story that we're continuing to learn more about, and the freedom seekers that came here to the Peck Homestead. Now, as we look at Susan Peck being a talented artist, it's clear that Sheldon wanted all of his children to be educated. And the abolitionist movement has ties to reform, educational reform, also temperance. And where we're standing right now, we're standing in the west part of the house, and we do believe that this was where the school was. Now we know also from Frank Peck's journals that Harriet and Sheldon were making sure that freedom seekers that were coming here were learning how to read and write, and that's a huge thing. But he also, Sheldon and Harriet, wanted to make sure not only his male children knew how to read and write and knew arithmetic and all of those skills, he wanted to make sure that all the children here in the community had access to education. And that's a real shift during this time period versus public education wasn't a standardized thing. And we know that Almedale J. Powers Dodge, which we have featured here, was the first teacher here. And so, as we say, Sheldon and Harriet believed in education, and to actually pay a school teacher to teach not only their children and the children of the community was a huge thing. So public education, temperance. So we know that there were a number of gatherings here hosted on the farm called temperance picnics. And they believed that alcohol was the gateway to rowdiness, and it just the Pecks were very much in mind that drinking was the devil's work and not a good thing for community, and really were against it. Sheldon was also a pacifist. Now, and this was huge because when the Civil War broke out, his son Sanford Peck ran away and joined the Civil War. Now, what we also know about Old Charlie, which was a recent discovery, Old Charlie left the Peck Homestead to join the colored troops. And we do know that the 29th Illinois Regiment out of Illinois, they joined up in Quincy and then in Chicago, was a group of colored troops. Now, according to Frank, Old Charlie never returned back to the homestead, and they felt very strongly that if Old Charlie could have, he would have come back to the Pecks. And so they believe that he died on the battlefield, which we don't have any documentation of, but the Pecks felt really strongly that he would have returned home. So we are led to believe that Charlie died in a battle on the battlefield. Sanford Peck did return home now, so that is a story for another day. But as we talk about the abolitionist movement, this started really in the 1840s, the abolitionist movement. And there were different reasons for people being abolitionists. And Sheldon is considered a radical abolitionist. He is not he is anti-slavery. He is very much in mind of doing anything and everything to help freedom seekers. He's actually listed in the New York Times as a radical abolitionist. And so the questions that we typically get is, well, what does that mean exactly? Now, you could be anti-slavery, and that meant that you thought slavery was wrong, that you weren't going to participate in it, but you didn't necessarily mind if your neighbor owned a slave. Being an abolitionist meant you weren't going to own a slave, you didn't want your neighbors owning a slave, but most people didn't want slavery coming to the north. So when we talk about Illinois being a free state, it's more or less that most people didn't want slavery coming to Illinois to take away jobs. When you got to Southern Illinois, there were some different opinions about what was going on, slavery. When we look at Alton, Illinois, we look at Lovejoy, who is a printer. And he actually, his story is very sad in the fact that he had a printing press talking about the anti-slavery movement, and he actually was, he was murdered. And this is taking place in Illinois, which is a free state. So this is, a very complicated, story when we're looking at what it means to be anti-slavery, an abolitionist, or a radical abolitionist. It was still illegal. So in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, and this was a federal mandate. And so any freedom seeker, if you were caught, you could receive a fine, you could go to jail. And when we think about kind of the division in the country, as you got further south, the punishment for harboring fugitive slaves got more severe. So it wasn't just so much getting a fine or going to jail, you could actually be hung. And so when we talk about this, this is definitely a darker part of our history. And we don't take light of when we're talking about what Sheldon was doing, because he's breaking the law. And this is why there aren't a lot of documentation. There's not a lot of documentation when it comes to being able to verify an Underground Railroad site, is because it was punishable. And now, in the case of Sheldon, we know that there were multiple freedom seekers that came to the home. There were multiple barns here on the property originally. But if we look here, these are Peck's anti-slavery friends. And so these are known connections that Sheldon had. And being a painter, itinerant painter, he was traveling to paint people. Sheldon was very unassuming. And so him traveling, he had a reason. He had a reason to be on the road and traveling near and wide from here to St. Louis to Chicago. And Sheldon being very unassuming, he wouldn't have been stopped. Now, we know about Peck's relationship because of who he painted. Now, many of his subjects were also part of the anti-slavery movement. We know, like families like the Wagner family, they were part of the King County Anti-Slavery Society. We also know that the Giffords in Elgin were part of the King County Anti-Slavery Society. And others on this board have ties to either the Illinois Anti-Slavery Society or other organizations that were tied to the abolitionist movement. You knew who you knew, and it created a network. Now, the Wagner family, which is very interesting, they're painting. Mr. Wagner's holding a painting called The Western Citizen, which is a known abolitionist newspaper out of Chicago, and that was created by Eastman and Philo Carpenter. They were editors and creators of The Western Citizen, and there's information in this about the King County anti-slavery meetings, the Illinois anti-slavery meetings, and again, this is another form of documentation. This is a big deal too. The Wagner painting, Mr. Wagner holding this painting, in his painting holding the newspaper, is a very public statement. Many, if they came to the Wagner home, would have known what the Western Citizen was, that it was an abolitionist newspaper. And being an abolitionist wasn't a popular idea. We look back at after the Civil War, and most people are like, oh yeah, of course I was an abolitionist, of course I was against slavery. But before that, being an abolitionist was almost a derogatory term. And so for Mr. Wagner to take such a stance, to having his family painting of him holding that paper is a big deal. And you can look at some of other Peck paintings, and you'll notice what the sitters are holding, and there's a lot of symbolism behind what people stood for, and this connection of people, this network. And this is in a time where there isn't a telephone, there aren't text messages, and so it's really interesting to see how these connections were made and how all of these people participated in something that was bigger than themselves. And so we do know that Sheldon's connections and the work that all of these people are doing is far greater, and the Peck Homestead and Sheldon and Harriet and his family are just one moment, one point in this very complicated history. But when we talk about what does it mean, what were the reasons to being, against slavery? Some believed it was a moral reason. It went against God. And most people thought that it just was inhumane. And that's where Sheldon and Harriet really come from, that what was happening was wrong. And they were going to do anything and everything to help freedom seekers. And so we tell that story here. We tell the story of Old Charlie. We tell the story of the Peck family and their involvement in the Underground Railroad. Sheldon was a known conductor, as I said before. We know this because he's mentioned at the anti-slavery meeting in Joliet, Illinois, as being a radical abolitionist. And so for us, the Sheldon Peck Homestead, though it's a modest house, it definitely has a radical history. And so I welcome you to come and visit us here in Lombard, Illinois, and come and see the Sheldon Peck Homestead. Now this is just a snippet of what the Peck Homestead is and a bit about the Underground Railroad and the pioneer life and the hardships that Harriet and Sheldon and the children had here at the Peck Homestead. I hope you'll visit us soon.
Thank you all. I'm so glad you guys are able to join us. I hope you guys all enjoyed our, we said in the video, our very short snippet of what it means to be, in Sheldon and Harriet's shoes. So at this time, I definitely encourage you guys, if you have questions, please either you can pop them in the chat or you can feel free to unmute yourself. We definitely want to answer any and all questions that you guys may have.
And we know this is kind of a complicated, there might be some complicated questions, and we're happy to ask them and answer them.
I say, well, if no one has any questions, they're still percolating. I know one of my favorite things about the Pecks that we didn't necessarily mention in the video, which ties into probably my favorite object there, is we have a large life-size plastic sheep outside who we lovingly call Bubbles, who's a merino sheep. And we know that the Pecks raised merino sheep for their wool. It's a really luxurious wool. If you're able to get your hands on it, like even today, it goes for a very high price. But we know the Pecks chose to raise sheep for the merino sheep for their wool because they didn't want to support the institution of cotton for clothes making and cotton fabric from the South. So when we talk about him, really embodying the spirit of the abolitionist, he's putting, his money where his mouth is, really making sure that he's not supporting anything that could potentially, tie this back to the cruelty of, enslaved people.
Yeah, and also what's interesting is that people, Sheldon and Harriet were Methodists, Free Methodist, and we know that other Methodists traded in merino sheep, and so there's a kind of an interesting theory behind, like-minded people, again, a network of people. And so we know that Sheldon Peck painted the Stolps, the Stolp cranes, and they're out of Aurora, and they had basically a wool processing company industry. And so again, it's that other connection, another person to talk about the Underground Railroad, to have this network of passing information. And so it's interesting when you look at everyone that Sheldon Peck painted. And that's what I find really fascinating, is that all of the paintings, when you start delving into the sitters, if we know who they are, their stories and how they're connected to Sheldon. And, because Sheldon would have spent, a month or more with the sitter. This wasn't, something that was done overnight. He would spend a great deal of time at the homestead. So there is a question. So when you give tours to children's school groups, what is one of the most frequent questions they ask or thing they are surprised to learn on their visit? Well, actually, we were just talking about that today, which was kind of funny, and it has nothing to do with the Underground Railroad. but it has to do with where wax comes from.
Yeah, so we're really excited. We're getting honeybees this year. And so it's a lot of the question is with kids is figuring out where does products come from? Because, you know, we always try and put that the Pecks were the very first settlers in Lombard. And, you know, today, right in front of us, I'm glad you couldn't hear it, but there's a very busy train track. It connects, you know, directly into the city of Chicago. Trains are constantly going past it. We're a very busy town. But when the Pecks came here, there was nothing. And so trying to get that into students' heads of like figuring out that where they live, there was pretty much just trees and prairies around here. And that's kind of the most surprising thing to learn about. Also with kind of the standard, you know, where's that there was no running water, you know, no electricity, just really how different their lives would have been.
No Home Depot to go buy
Yeah.
lumber.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, where does your food come from? Most kids don't understand that, you know, the hamburger you get at the grocery store came from a cow. So that, you know, when you're teaching children about where their food comes from, and you know, kind of putting that in perspective, those are some of the most common questions. I think what's always interesting is when, because the train came to Babcock's Grove in 1848, and Sheldon sold property to the railroad for the train to come through. But I think the confusion comes in a little bit is when you're talking about the Underground Railroad, you talk about trains and conductors. And so I think people talk about hidey holes with us, or, you know, the train's right there, you know, or the train was underground, like an actual train. And we get that from adults. It's probably a big misconception is that the Underground Railroad is more of a secret language. And when we explain that to kids, they understand that. So I think those are, I mean, places where food comes from, where things come from, are some of the common things.
I say, where else can you see Sheldon Peck's paintings, some of his sons and his daughters? Sheldon Peck frustratingly didn't keep any of his own paintings because being a portrait maker, they obviously went to the families. So they're across the country. I believe the Art Institute in Chicago has some.
They have the Welch paintings, the Welches, which
I
are
believe
painted in
there's
Chicago.
some in New York. We
Mhm.
have one in our collection. I know Aurora has some.
St. Charles History Museum, the Elgin History Museum. Sheldon was painting all along in King County, so you can see a lot of the same, around the same time frame. There are 53 known Sheldon Pecks. That number's right.
I believe, yeah.
And because Sheldon didn't sign his artwork, he, like we said in our little program tonight, so we're always discovering new Sheldon Pecks, which is or people who think Sheldon Pecks are Sheldon Peck. That's always fun emails that we get sometimes.
Yeah.
And we're like, nope, that's not a Peck.
In regards to some of his sons and daughters' work, so his son Charles, those three, we have a couple in our collection, so you can see those on display. We also, it was Charles painted some of the boards of the house, where when we did the reconstruction to restore it back to its, you know, 1800s configuration, we actually found those boards behind the wall, which was a really cool discovery. And then some of Susan paintings of some of her family still, or her descendants still have the originals, as well as we obviously have the painting of old Charlie, but those are really the ones that I know of.
Charles and Susan aren't considered as in high regard as Sheldon is. So Sheldon in the 1990s, the 90s, late 80s, early 90s on Antiques Roadshow. It's finally known as Uncle George. Sheldon is considered an incredible folk artist. He in the folk art market. One of his paintings almost sold for $1 million back in the 90s. It was like $800,000. In 2019, another one sold for about $200,000 at auction. So in the 70s is when the Whitney did the exhibition on Sheldon Peck. And we did ours in 2019, where We had a number of private collectors, and we actually have a gallery book about different Peck paintings that were in the exhibit. So he is considered a master in the folk art world. We don't see a lot of his children's work in museums, but his work can be seen kind of nationally.
Yeah, I think we're probably the only institution who has his children's work on display right now, which is kind of ironic because Charles helped found the Art Institute, or what would become the Art Institute of Chicago. So it's surprising they don't have more of his work since he was very connected in the art world.
And when Charles went out west, which is really interesting, he made this giant thing called an audiocam, which was basically this giant landscapes on like this giant roller to show scenes of the West. And so he's known for his landscapes.
Awesome.
Are there any other questions? I love this. I always love questions.
Yes, definitely our favorite part of it. I say, well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and post in the chat. This is just the links to the upcoming Taste of Histories, including the webpage where it lists all of the institutions who are joining us, as well as where you can register for all of them. And then, as I said, this is a totally free program. We're more than happy to offer it free of charge. However, if you want to support us and the other institutions who are participating, feel free to use that PayPal link to donate directly to us, and all the proceeds will be split between all the institutions who are joining us.
And Lombard Historical Society is handling all the donations for the museums. So you'll see that through the LHS website. So there's a question about that. It's all of us are non-for-profit, so the proceeds, are tax deductible. Every little bit counts. We are so excited about this network of museums who wanted to get on board with this crazy idea to do a Taste of History every Tuesday night. And so we're excited about Alaska. There's actually 2 museums in Alaska, another one in Scotland. There's some just really great museums that are participating in this.
Yes, next week is the Rosa Parks Museum with Troy University. So especially if you were interested, in our conversation about the Underground Railroad today, this is, another part of that same kind of topic and journey. So I'm personally really excited for that one.
I'm excited also about the Unsinkable Molly Brown Museum. So, Molly Brown, who was on the Titanic, that's the next week after that.
I believe so.
So there's a great lineup. And I think this is with COVID-19, this is a great way to travel and from the safety of your home. And, museums have a lot to offer even now, and virtual programming's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. And we do have a number of virtual programs still coming up. So please, check out our programming and our partners' websites and their programming too. So thank you guys for coming tonight.
Yes. I say with that, I will go ahead and close us out. Once again, thank you all for joining, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.